As we prepare our minds and hearts for our offering, as we turn to our weekly meditation on giving, I want you to turn this morning to the 28th chapter of the book of Genesis. The 20th chapter of the book of Genesis. Last week we began looking at one of the philosophies of giving, which I referred to as a false basis of biblical giving. We had looked at two others, and the third I had identified as the idea that the Bible demands that Christians tithe. While some churches teach tithing out of fear of not having enough money to keep the church operative, which is really an indictment on the sad state of that church and the sad state of the Christians that comprise it. You have to force giving in order to survive. Some churches do have a biblically framed argument for its practice. And so while we don't abide by the idea of the demand of tithing, there are some biblical bases people use to argue for its existence. I want to give them to you and then begin this Sunday refuting them. The first line of argumentation for the tithe is that since tithing took place prior to the giving of the law, it was the standard of giving to the Lord and therefore supersedes the law, being the expected way of interacting with God financially. So tithing is in the book of Genesis. Because it's in the book of Genesis, it's not tied to the law. We're still under it because it supersedes the law. That's the first argument. The second argument is, since grace brings with it more responsibility, not less, if tithing was the standard of giving under the law, grace must at least do that, not less. Now, there are some other arguments to tithing, but those two kind of summarize all the other ones. So let's look at both of those real quickly. Well, I'm going to look at one this week, and we'll look at the other one throughout the next couple of weeks. Giving before the law. The scripture is pretty clear on what giving before the law was all about. There are 5 clear cases of giving to the Lord in the book of Genesis, besides the mentions of altars being built unto the Lord. I want to give you those for your study later, and then I want to make a statement about them. They are Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 through 7, Genesis chapter 8, verse 20 through 22, Genesis chapter 14, verse 17 through 24, Genesis 28, verse 18 through 22, and Genesis 46, verse 1. In each of these 5 cases, without variance, the amount of the offering is plainly based on the individual's decision. In other words, as you read those 5 passages, what you're going to find out is that in each case, the offering is given based on the free will choice of the giver. In other words, in none of those cases is there a command in the passage to give a tenth. The reason the tenth is given is because that's what the person chose to give in those texts. It was the amount that person believed in his heart he wanted to give. While it was to be brought and how it might be brought and what was to be brought might be prescribed by God, how much you brought was left up to you. Clearly in Genesis chapter 4, Cain and Abel had to bring a certain type of sacrifice. How much of that sacrifice was left up to their own hearts? And from Genesis then, before the law, we can conclude that the standard of giving was free will giving, that is, the amount being determined by the giver based on his view and relationship with God. See, this is the heart of it. How do you view God? How much do you love God? It should show up in how much you choose to give. Even when the concept of tithing is brought up in these texts in Genesis, it was always in the context of the free decision of the giver. At the most, it might be concluded that the Hebrew term for tithe did not occur in these texts because of a decision by God. In other words, not God commanding them to give the tenth, but it was the ancient cultural and societal practice of taxation of the tenth that I talked about last time. So the reason there's tenth in some of these texts is because that is the culture and society of the day. In the text itself is no command from God. Now, you're in Genesis chapter 28. Why did I have you turn there? In one of these texts, Genesis 28:18 through 22, the word tithe appears, and it was used by Jacob, now watch this, church, as an attempt to bribe God out of what God had already promised to do. In this sense, Jacob used the concept of the tithe as many prosperity preachers do today. Not only do they misunderstand the tithe, but then even worse than that, they pervert the tithe further and think that they will receive a special blessing from God when they give the tithe. This whole concept of God is going to bless me when I give the tithe is used by the prosperity church to pervert giving. Look at what Jacob does here, beginning in Genesis 28, verse 18. So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. And he called the name of the place Bethel. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that thou givest me, I will surely give a tenth to thee. Now, if you read back in this context, you'll see all these things Jacob said, God had already promised he was going to do them. Jacob, the schemer, is thinking he can distort and twist from God by promising the tenth. If God does what God had already promised, I'm going to do it. We got to be very, very careful, church, with those who want to manipulate us in our giving. God is expressed in our giving in that our love for him, the depth of our love for him, is manifested in how much we choose to give. If we give very little, we must love him very little. If we give much, we obviously love him much. It's a manifestation of our love. And so as we turn to giving at this time, let's keep in mind that we're giving God out of our love and a desire to express to him just how deeply and richly our hearts belong to him. Amen. Keep that in mind as the ushers prepare to receive our offering at this time.